Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of Sigfredo Alvarez. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. One of the most dangerous psychological states a human being can enter is the state of fixation born from proximity. We often fear the stranger in the dark alley or the random act of violence in a public place. However, statistics and psychological studies consistently show us that the greatest threat often lives right next door. In the case of Sigfredo Alvarez, we see the terrifying evolution of a neighborhood grudge into a terminal event. This is not just a story about a sudden snap in judgment. It's a study in the psychology of the escalation where minor slights and property disputes fester into a singular deadly obsession. The human brain is wired to protect its territory. It's a trait that ensures our survival. But when that territorial instinct becomes maladaptive, it creates a lens through which the neighbor is no longer a person, but an enemy combatant. The suspect in this case did not seemingly view his victim as a famous actor or a grieving man. He viewed him as a target. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the environment that cultivated this rage. The setting is San Antonio, Texas, on the street that should have been a sanctuary. Jonathan Joss was a man whose voice was known to millions. He was the talent behind John Redcorn on the animated series King of the Hill. He brought joy and laughter to the screen, but at home he was facing a series of devastating life stressors. In January of 2025, a fire ravaged Joss's home. This is a critical psychological factor in the victimology of the case. Trauma often begets vulnerability. Josh did not just lose a structure, he lost his sanctuary, and tragically, his 3 dogs perished in the blaze. Psychologically speaking, losing a home and pet simultaneously places a person in a high state of alert and profound grief. He was living in a state of displacement. When a person is displaced, their stress hormones, like cortisol, remain elevated. They are hypervigilant, and their emotional reserves are depleted. Josh and his husband, Tristan, were trying to rebuild their lives from the ashes. But while they were dealing with the trauma of the fire, another threat was looming just a few doors down. Sigfredo Alvarez lived nearby. Reports indicate that there was a bad blood between the men for a significant amount of time. This brings us to the psychological concept of the festering wound. In neighborhood disputes, the brain can begin to ruminate on negative interactions. Every time the neighbors see each other, the neural pathways associated with anger and defenses are strengthened. It becomes a cycle of reinforcement. You see the person and you feel angry. You feel angry, so you look for reasons to justify that anger. Over time, this dehumanizes the neighbor. They stop being a human with a family and feelings and become the object of scorn. We don't have public records detailing Alvarez's childhood or early developmental history, so we must analyze the behavior that exhibited as an adult to understand his psychological profile. His behavior suggests a lack of impulse control coupled with a rigid thinking pattern. Rigid thinking is a cognitive distortion where a person believes their way is the only way. They cannot see the perspective of the other side. In a dispute, this makes conflict resolution nearly impossible because the rigid thinker perceives compromise as a threat. On June 1st, 2025, the tension on Dorsey Drive reached its breaking point. Josh and his husband returned to the site of their burned-down home. They were there simply to check the mail. This act of checking mail is mundane and routine. It represents a connection to normal life. But for Alvarez, this presence seems to have been a trigger. A trigger in psychology is a stimulus that elicits an intense emotional reaction. For a person harboring a deep grudge, the mere sight of the object of their hate can cause a psychological spike in adrenaline. Witnesses and reports state that Alvarez parked his vehicle behind the car Josh was using. This is a significant behavioral clue. It demonstrates an intent to block or trap. It is a dominance move. Psychologically, this suggests that Alvarez was seeking a confrontation. He was not avoiding the source of his stress. He was pursuing it. This is the difference between defensive aggression and offensive aggression. Defensive aggression is reactive, protecting oneself from an immediate threat. Offensive aggression is proactively seeking to intimidate or harm. Blocking a car is an assertion of that control. It sends a message that says, "You are not leaving until I say so." Arguments ensued. Verbal altercations are common in these types of long-standing feuds. They usually serve as a pressure release valve. People yell, they scream, they vent their frustration, and then they retreat. But on this day, the pressure did not release. It exploded. According to accounts from Josh's husband, derogatory slurs were used. This is a critical element for our psychological analysis. The use of slurs, particularly homophobic ones, is a form of othering. It is a psychological mechanism used to strip the victim of their dignity and humanity. By reducing a person to a slur, the aggressor distances themselves from the moral weight of their actions. It makes violence easier to commit because in the aggressor's mind, they are not hurting a person. They are attacking a label they despise. If these allegations are true, it adds a layer of bias-motivated aggression to the profile. Hate is a powerful fuel for violence. It bypasses logic and empathy, replacing them with disgust and rage. Josh stood his ground. We must consider the psychological state of the victim here as well. He was standing on the property where he lost everything. He was likely feeling protective of his husband and his remaining territory. The intersection of the two men, both feeling territorial and both flooded with adrenaline, is a volatile mix. But only one of them brought a weapon into the equation. Alvarez allegedly produced a firearm. The introduction of the lethal weapon changes the psychological landscape entirely. It shifts the dynamic from the social conflict to a survival situation. The decision to introduce a gun suggests a desire for finality. It's the ultimate silencer of opposition. In the heat of the moment, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for reasoning and consequence analysis, often shuts down. The amygdala, which controls our fight or flight response, takes over. However, the fact that Alvarez allegedly parked, blocked, and then engaged suggests that there was a window of time for decision-making. This was not a split-second reaction to a physical attack. It appears to have been a culmination of an escalation ladder. Josh was shot and killed. The voice that entertained millions was silenced in the senseless act of neighborhood violence. His husband witnessed the horror. The psychological impact on the witness in a case like this is catastrophic. To watch a partner die is a primary trauma. To watch them die at the hands of a neighbor adds a layer of complex betrayal to the trauma. Home is supposed to be safe. When violence enters the sphere of the home, it shatters the fundamental assumption of safety. After the shooting, Alvarez's behavior provides us with more psychological data. Police arrived at the scene. Reports indicate that Alvarez admitted to the act. He allegedly told officers, "I shot him." This admission is interesting. Sometimes, after a violent release of rage, there is a sudden drop in emotional arousal. The person creates a psychological distance from the event, or conversely, they feel justified. An immediate confession can sometimes stem from a state of shock, or it can stem from a belief that they were in the right. We see this in cases of self-defense, but we also see it in cases of righteous indignation. If a perpetrator believes their victim was a villain, they may not feel the immediate need to hide their actions. They may believe that once the police hear their side of the story, they'll understand. It is a distortion of reality where the perpetrator views themselves as the victim who finally fought back. Alvarez was arrested and later indicted by the grand jury. As of November 2025, he faces murder charges. We must look at the broader psychological implications of this tragedy. Why do neighbor disputes turn deadly? It comes down to the inability to escape. In most conflicts, you can walk away. You can leave a job, you can leave a relationship, You can avoid a specific bar or restaurant, but you can't easily leave your home. This creates a pressure cooker environment. The stress is chronic, not acute. Chronic stress changes the chemistry of the brain. It enlarges the amygdala, making us more reactive to perceived threats. It shrinks the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and emotional regulation. Living next to an enemy keeps the body in a constant state of fight or flight. For Alvarez, if he was indeed fixated on Josh and his household, every day was a battle. Every time he looked out his window, he saw the source of his agitation. This lack of respite prevents the brain from resettling to a baseline of calm. The tension builds and builds until a catalyst occurs. In this case, the catalyst was simply checking the mail. It seems trivial to the outside observer, but in the distorted reality of the feud, it was likely perceived as a major transgression. We also have to speculate on the role of control. Neighborhood disputes are often about control over one's environment. Noise boundaries, fences, parking spots, these are all proxies for control. When a person feels they are losing control over their environment, they may resort to extreme measures to regain it. The fire that destroyed Josh's home may have altered the landscape literally and figuratively. It left a scar in the neighborhood. For the victim, it was a tragedy. For the neighbor, we do not know how he perceived it, but his subsequent action suggests zero empathy. Empathy erosion is a key indicator in violent offenders. They look at a neighbor who just lost their home and dogs and feel rage instead of compassion. It signals a severe deficit in emotional resonance. This lack of empathy allows the offender to prioritize their own grievances above the suffering of others. It's a narcissistic trait. The narcissist sees themselves as a main character and everyone else as supporting actors who are either helping them or hindering them. If Josh was perceived as a hindrance, Alvarez's psyche may have deleted the empathy usually afforded to a grieving man. The indictment suggests the legal system sees this as a criminal act, not a justifiable one. But the legal system deals with facts and laws, while we deal with the minds and motives. The motive here seems to be a total annihilation of a perceived nuisance. It's the ultimate act of intolerance. When we analyze the specific choice of a firearm, we are looking at the psychology of power. A gun creates an immediate and irreversible power imbalance. It compensates for any feelings of inadequacy or loss of control the shooter may be feeling. For a man in his late 50s like Alvarez, engaging in a physical altercation carries risk. A weapon negates that risk. It guarantees dominance. This need for dominance is often rooted in deep-seated insecurity. Secure individuals do not need to brandish weapons to resolve verbal disputes. They have the emotional tools to de-escalate or the confidence to walk away. The resort to lethal force is often a sign of emotional bankruptcy. The individual has run out of coping mechanisms. They have no words left, only violence. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Josh was a public figure. This adds a layer of parasocial grief to the case. Fans feel they knew him through his voice and his characters. But to this killer, he was just the man next door. This juxtaposition is jarring. It reminds us that fame and talent do not insulate a person from the basic dangers of human conflict. Josh was not killed by a stalker obsessed with his work. He was killed by the mundane friction of proximity. We must also touch upon the concept of confirmation bias in the aggressor. If Alvarez held prejudiced views against Josh due to his sexual orientation or heritage, every action Josh took would be filtered through that lens. If Josh laughed, it was mocking. If Josh looked at him, it was glaring. If Josh checked his mail, it was trespassing or provoking. Confirmation bias reinforces the narrative that the victim is the aggressor. It allows the perpetrator to build a case in their own mind where violence becomes the only logical conclusion. This is why de-escalating neighborhood disputes early is so vital. Once the narrative of us versus them sets in, it's very difficult to dislodge. Mediation often fails because the parties are operating in different realities. In the reality of the victim, he was picking up the mail at his property. In the reality of the perpetrator, he was invading territory. When realities clash, violence often fills the gap. The aftermath of this crime leaves a husband grieving and a community in shock. The psychological recovery for the witnesses and the loved ones will be a long journey. Trauma of this magnitude rewires the nervous system. It creates a world where safety feels like an illusion. For the perpetrator, the reality of his actions will likely set in slowly. The adrenaline fades, the righteous indication often crumbles when faced with the concrete walls of a prison cell. The "I shot him" confession, which may have been spoken with defiance, becomes a sentence of its own. It's an admission that closes the door on freedom. This case serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of social contracts. We agreed to live side by side, to follow the rules, respect boundaries. When one person decides to break that contract, the consequences can be fatal. It challenges us to look at our own conflicts, to look at the small grievances we hold on to, and to recognize the danger of letting them fester. The distance between a verbal argument and a fatal shooting is shorter than we like to think. It is bridged by anger, by bias, and by the availability of lethal means. Sigfredo Alvarez crossed that bridge, and because of that, the world lost Jonathan Josh. We are left with the silence where a voice used to be, and we are left with the questions that will always follow such senseless acts. Could it have been prevented? Were the signs ignored? The indictment is just the beginning of the legal process, but the psychological scars are already permanent. What did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? Let me know. If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.